Imagine Lagos at the midnight. To paint a picture, let me give you a detailed breakdown, or a quick breakdown, maybe not so detailed. August 1st, 1966 to July 1975. Now, Yakubu Gowon was the military head of state, and he had led Nigeria through the Civil War, which ended in January 1970. And then 1975, he was ousted by a coup led by Brigadier Muritala Mohammed, who took over in a bloodless coup and initiated plans to return to democracy. And then from February 1976 until October 1979, Major General Olusegun Obasanjo, who succeeded Mohammed, Brigadier Muritala Mohammed, after his assassination. And then he oversaw the transition to civilian rule, handing over power in 1979. So in the mid-1970s, soldiers on the streets, they point at night, rumors are moving faster than newspapers. In the middle of this whole tension, there's one house that refuses to behave the way the state expects. The house, Kalakuta Republic, Baba Fela Kuti's compound, his home, his studio, and his declaration of independence from the Nigerian government. It was a physical space, but it was also a statement. We are not playing by your rules. Because of that statement, because of that declaration, the police were constantly watching, the government irritated and tried to instigate. But Fela, as he's often characterized by, was loud on stage, on record, and even in interviews. He named names, he mocked generals, he turned gossip into lyrics and policy into punchlines. And one day, the story goes, the police tried a totally different tactic. They come for him with a familiar accusation of, you have weed, you are storing weed, therefore they raided, they arrested, and in a small but important moment, before they can use the joint or weed as evidence, Fela swallows it. It took Fela to the station, and then the state decides to turn biology into a trap. If they can just wait long enough, the reason nature will cooperate, he would need to excrete. And if they can get that excrement, test it, and find traces of drug, even the slightest trace, they will have their proof. So they placed him under observation in a cell. And then the story continues that, or the story says, there is a bucket ready. The Nigerian state, with all its power, is literally waiting for a man to defecate. The legend continues that Fela outsmarts them. He arranges, depending on which version you hear, for another inmate's feces to be presented instead, which means he exchanges feces with another inmate after he presents. So he mentioned, biology has taken its course. I have excreted. Here is my feces. The test fails to prove anything, which meant the police, the Nigerian state, did not have anything against him. And so they had to let him go free. So having turned the state's attempt at assimilation into a kind of slapstick farce, most people after such an experience would try to forget it, would try everything to put it behind them. They will even try to bury the memory and move on. But Fela does the opposite. He names the story. He records the story. He presses it into a vinyl. He turns it into an album called Expensive Shit. Hi, my name is G and I am a former librarian. On my African bookshelf, my role is to guide you to engaging exploratory works on and about Africa. So talk about books, albums, films, and oral stories that can serve as starting points for your own research and reflection. And today, we're placing the album Expensive Shit on my African bookshelf. So, Expensive Shit. Expensive Shit is the 12th full-length studio album by Fela Anikulapo Kuti and African 70. And it was released in 1975 at the height of Fela's confrontation with Nigeria's military government. It's a compact record in terms of track list with just 2 extended pieces. But though compact, it's expensive in everything else. Side A is the title track Expensive Shit, and side B is Water No Get Enemy. Let's start with Expensive Shit. Expensive Shit begins with a bright, repetitive guitar lick and a vamping piano, soon joined by drums, bass, and a full horn section. The instruments move almost in a call and response format with one another. So it sounds like an instrument plays or the horn plays and then the other instruments come to respond. If you listen closely, it sounds like every instrument has something to say, and together they form a complex but surprisingly harmonious ensemble. And this ensemble or this unison sounds as if every instrument is narrating a slightly different angle on the same event or same situation or experience. It really does sound as if the horn is narrating a story that the guitar understands or has experienced, and then the piano is playing, almost alluding to the fact that yes, I have experienced that same encounter that the horn and the guitar was explaining. And this makes it so beautiful to hear. And then Fela begins to sing, and the first set of lyrics starts from something very literal and very universal. Nobody wants to see the shit or excreta, let alone someone else's shit or excreta. And from that everyday or very relatable truth, Fela slides into the story of the police incident. And then from there, the track begins or becomes part humiliation, part comedy, and part open insults to the authorities who thought they could break him with a bucket. So he takes a moment of attempted disgrace that was a moment where they wanted to finally nail him for something, and he twists it and retells it into an entire story that is based on his own terms. And the piece closes with another stretch of dense instrumentation, as if the band is signing off in agreement with the tale. And the agreement is, yes, we agree. We concord to how you handle the story, the unison of the instruments, production, the way the music is arranged is so beautifully done that it really tells the story and you can feel the emotions through those instruments. Now, side B, No Get Enemy. Water No Get Enemy, by contrast, is built around the Yoruba proverb and feels more philosophical on first listen. It meditates on water and water's inevitable usefulness, its quiet power, and its uses in our everyday life. And he uses this philosophical idea to create an image to invite us to think about forces that cannot be permanently owned or defeated. Where expensive shit, the track, a burst in with guitar and hot, Water No Get Enemy arrives more like an announcement, almost like an ikede. Ikede means announcement in Yoruba. Saxophone steps forward first, then the other instruments gather around it to add to the tale or the philosophical idea that is being passed. And the song reminds us that things which appear mild, like water, like love, can be deeply potent, especially when it seems like we use, in this case, water for everyday use. And because of its usefulness, it doesn't need to exert force. Everybody loves it regardless. It's so useful. So musically, both tracks are anchored in the same word, classic Afrobeat. It's long, unhurried grooves that give the band space to stretch. I mean, you listen to it and more than half of it is instrumentation and combination or coming together of different instruments. And then the horn sections feel like arguments, sharp, layered, full of call and response. And then the vocals moving between the lead and the chorus, turning listeners into participants, almost like a conversation happening within a conversation. And then a rhythm section that behaves less like drums and bars and more like living organism, constantly emotional, constantly adjusting. You don't simply put on this album, you enter into his timing. And when I was doing research or I was working on this episode, one thing I did was, even though I have the Venom, I went on my music streaming platform, my use Apple Music, put on my noise cancelling headphones, sat in the dark, and tried to immerse myself into, almost transport myself into the arena where this was being played. Yeah, it might sound abstract, but I just really wanted to get a full sense in terms of emotion at that time, especially when I've read so much on what was happening around that time period. So you realize, you listen to it and your body starts to groove. You start to understand that every instrument, every beat, the chorus, the lyrics, they are intentionally placed where they are to pass a message. And maybe sometimes before you realize it, your body is already in that groove and you already sense what the musician or creator, in this case Fela, is trying to pass. Enough of trying to be philosophical and all that. Let's talk about the moment that it was produced, right? So to understand the expensive shit, we have to sit for a moment in the Nigeria that it was produced in. I mean, the context, what was happening at that time. Like I said, Nigeria, most of the, if not all, 1870, Nigeria was being ruled by military rulers so there was coup upon coup, bloodless, and there was thirst for power. People or generals or military rulers thinking they had the answer to whatever questions or query that was plaguing Nigeria at that time. And so Nigeria was in full-fledged military rule. And it was also a time where oil boom, oil wealth, there was deep inequality and growing repression of dissent. So people who were against the regime, people who didn't agree or who spoke out, activists, were being silenced, or the rulers were trying to silence them. So oil money was flowing, but it wasn't flowing to everyone. It wasn't flowing to Nigerians. And then because of that, cities were growing, there was tension in the land. There were whispers. People didn't want to say things that would land them in trouble. And so when voices speak against or too loudly against the system, most of the time, if not all the time, the responses is not a polite op-ed. It's often a knock on your door about being against the government, and you get arrested. So in that context, Calcutta Republic is more than just a house where the musician lives. Because of the reputation that Fela had built over the years, it was a symbol and it was a provocation to the Nigerian government at the time. So inside Calcutta, musicians, activists, and even outsiders lived communally. And there was even a nightclub called The Shrine, which doubled as a spiritual and political gathering point. So in that space, music was not just entertainment. It was open criticism of the government or the regime at the time. And it was delivered at high volume with so much dancing and celebration, almost as if I wouldn't just insult or speak against you. I will have fun doing so. So the state predictably does not treat this as harmless experiments, because it just meant that more people found community of people who were against the government to speak. We encouraged citizens and activists and everybody from all walks of life to come together and speak against the government. So there were raids, arrests, and eventually brutal attacks on the compound and its inhabitants. And so think about it, in that climate, in that time period, to release an album that mocks the police, that retells or states their failure, and circulates that story to thousands of listeners, it's not just a small artistic decision. It's a direct act of defiance that was pressed into a record and into a vinyl. I mean, it was vinyl that was popular at that time. So I want you to think about it with so much oppression, and not oppression, not oppression that was followed with force, military force. And then there's this compound in the midst or in the eye of that oppression, trying to stand tall and talk back with music and celebration. Let us go a layer deeper and look at what these two tracks are actually doing underneath the groove. In Expensive Shit is, on one level, a vulgar joke, a story about feces that most parents would tell their words or children not to repeat at the dinner table, obviously. But beneath the laughter, it becomes a serious meditation on state control of the African body. Think about it. What the police are trying to do in that story is they are not just arresting Fela, or they did not just arrest Fela. They were trying to control what he ingests, monitor his digestion, and test his waste. His body becomes a site of investigation. His intestines become a border the state is trying to police. The message is clear. There's no part of you we cannot claim the right to examine. And by turning this into a song, Fela flips the direction of the gaze. Instead of the state quietly watching him, he invites the public to watch the state. He asks us to notice their desperation, their pettiness, their willingness to sit around waiting for a man to use a bucket. Expensive Shit in the title stops being just potential evidence. It becomes a symbol of energy, time, and resources the state is willing to spend to humiliate and control a citizen. So when you look at part of what makes this track so powerful, you notice that it is how Fela tells the story. He does not stand there and deliver a dry, straight, this is what happened, this is how it happened. He weaves it into music through repetition of key phrases, call and response, with the band and chorus, and the little pockets of laughter inside the groove. The band is not just backing it, they are in on the joke. In his hands, humor becomes a weapon. It strips the state of its aura and seriousness. He invites listeners to laugh at power, not just to fear it. It turns a private humiliation into a communal in-joke that officials cannot easily erase. And for many African listeners, this combination is very familiar. The way humor, proverbs, and storytelling are used to survive and critique arbitrary authority, it feels very familiar. Anywhere you look at or anywhere you can think of, just pick a place in the whole of Africa at one point in the recent history, the combination of state policing, using of humor to pass messages, inviting listeners and citizens with the use of creative platforms or avenues, and then trying to turn or pass a message through maybe it's tone, drawing, storytelling, what have you, is very familiar for most Africans. So instead of standing at a podium arguing with the regime using formal language, at that time, the most regime very good at, you can't argue with power. Fela flips that and then invites the whole neighborhood to dance and laugh at a story that he told in his own language and his own terms. And that way, everybody was in on it together at the expense of the government. Both tracks on Expensive Shit are long, I think. They are more than 10 minutes long. And this is not because Fela did not know how to edit. It was an obvious choice. The political message begins to sink in because you start to dance or groove, and it creates some sense of defiance. And inside all that, inside that time, grooving, people become less defensive than they would be if you are handed in pamphlets. I mean, imagine if Fela wanted to say a story and he was going around, this is what happened. Here's the pamphlet. Let us rise together. if it was a formal lecture, the reception would have been totally different. But by the time the full story of the police, the weed, or the joint, and the bucket arrives in the lyrics, listeners' bodies have already committed to the groove. And they are not just hearing an argument. They are listening and they are inside an experiment. Sorry, they are not just hearing an argument. They are inside and they are living in an experience by a fellow citizen. So this is political education by rhythm. It educates us on rights, how to use a different form of power to state our claim. The second track, Water No Get Enemy, is built on a Yoruba proverb. And on the surface, it feels simple. I mean, the song reminds us everyone needs water. Yeah, we all need water. No one can permanently fight it or resist it or even own it. And if you try to block it or disrespect it, you eventually pay the price. But in the context of military rule and oil wealth at the time, that simplicity becomes something more. A quiet theology of power. Regimes rise and fall, generals come and go, companies boom and collapse. But some forces, like fruits, nature, and even people themselves, I mean, the slow flow of history remain like water, necessary, patient, and beyond anybody's full control. When you place this side by side with expensive shit, they form an obvious good pairing, a very strong pairing. One track focused on absurdity and cruelty of the state's power at the time, another reminding us of deeper, slower forces that outlast any particular regime. And together, they say, yes, the state can do terrible things, but it is not the only force in the story. Let's take a step back from the album and look at the wider shelf. Where does expensive shit sit on my African bookshelf? First, it sits very close to folk tales we talked about in the Welcome episode, especially stories about Ijapa the tortoise. And in those tales, the powerful are often outwitted by the one they underestimate. So also, the album echoes themes we saw in the first book we reviewed, Empire of AI. In that book, an empire stretches itself out through data, infrastructure, and labor, reaching into people's lives through code and cloud platforms. Inexpensive shit, a state tries to extend itself into the most intimate parts of it. So what does this album reveal about how Africans see themselves and how the world sees Africa? Inside the music, Nigerians are not portrayed as passive victims of some faceless states. They are people who mock, resist, and re-narrate their reality even under real threats. The story of the bucket could have stayed as a piece of private shame, something that shouldn't be said. But Fela turns it into a communal song that basically says, look at what they tried to do and look at how foolish he made them look. From the outside, or for many global listeners, Expensive Shit is that classic Afrobeat record with the wild title and incredible groove. They hear the horns, the drums, the call and response, and they might even know the outline of the story. But there is a risk that the political risk behind the music gets flattened into a kind of aesthetic, a cool, radical flavor detached from the actual blood and broken bones suffered by the creator. So on this shelf, we're trying to hold both at once. And on one hand, the joy, the humor, the sheer musical genius of the record. And on the other hand, the very concrete violence, surveillance, humiliation that made such courage necessary in the first place. And there's also a lesson for the present. Just as Fela used saxophones, drums, musical instruments, and pidgin English to confront military power in the 1970s, today's African creators are using a different toolkit, from podcasts to YouTube to movies, films, to documentaries shot on phones and mobile devices, to even TikTok. They are responding to new forms of control, whether from government, corporations, or algorithms that decide what is visible and what is buried. So the tools change, the beats changes, the need to bear witness does not. So as we place expensive shit on the shelf, I want to leave you with a few questions, not as a test, but as companions or as starters into your road to research or introspection. When you listen to Fela or to any typical politically charged music, do you mostly hear it as a sound, or do you also hear it as an evidence? Evidence of how people were living at the time, and what shifts if you treat an album like it's like this expensive shit, an album like this as both a record and a historical document. Think about it. Think about what these themes, maybe listen to the album or listen to the record again and ask questions, do a deep dive into the various parts of ideas, thoughts, research that you've kind of shied away from. And honestly, you don't have to come up with an answer to these questions or the questions that you're even asking yourself immediately. It's enough to start noticing how often laughter, rhythm, and storytelling sit right next to pain for now, and how often that combination has helped people stay sane. We've just added another spine to my African bookshelf. And until next time, keep paying attention to the stories that are paying attention to you. Thank you, and see you next time, where we'll be talking on going deep into Chinua Achebe's An Exile. See you next time.